So Caroline and Safina, I'm just keeping an eye on the stream. We've got people joining at the moment. I'm going to give it another couple of minutes if that's okay with you. Caroline and Safina, I'm just keeping an eye on the stream. We've got people joining at the moment. I'm going to give it another couple of minutes if that's okay with you. Caroline and Safina, on the stream, we've got people joining at the moment. So good afternoon, everybody, from us here at Achates Philanthropy. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. This is our very first Achates Live online live stream session. So thank you very much for joining our very first session. I hope you will bear with us if we have any technical glitches this afternoon. Hopefully we won't. But if we do, we'll try to get back up online as soon as we possibly can. During the course of the session, we will be taking questions. So if you have any questions or anything you'd like to contribute to the conversation, do please drop a note into the comments box, which should be just to the right of your video on the screen. So firstly, some of us will know you and will have been to our regular Achates Live sessions, which take place at the Old Vic Theatre monthly usually. Obviously, due to COVID-19, we're no longer doing those sessions at the moment, but we were very keen to continue to support the sector, particularly at this difficult moment, and ensure that there are spaces for you to talk, to have conversations, and for us to try and advise you as best we can. Obviously, in this particular situation, it's very difficult for anyone to be a genuine expert because the situation is live, it's changing all the time. But what we would like to do is to try and bring you some of the understanding that we have about the current situation and about how it may affect the arts and culture, and some expert advice. So I'd like to introduce you today to our director, Caroline McCormick. Caroline, if you could give us a wave, we should see you up on our live stream screen. And thank you so much for joining us, Sulina Ahmad from the John Ellerman Foundation. Sulina, if you could give us a wave, hopefully everyone can see you. So this online version for us is a really swift response to the concerns that we are seeing coming up through the sector, particularly around loss of income from ticket sales, converting ticket sales into donations. How can organisations continue to develop relationships with their donors, with trusts, and what are the first responses that we're seeing coming out from the sector in terms of, we've seen some statutory responses this week, we've seen responses from some of the key strategic trusts and foundations. We should have approximately 100 people joining us. I can see we've got about 80 people online at the moment. So thank you so much for joining us, all of you. We are maintaining Chatham House rules, so those are exactly the same rules that we use for our live in-person sessions. So we can be free to speak as we choose, but obviously we ask that people speak kindly and respectfully to one another. So I think, the last thing I have to do in terms of a little piece of housekeeping, we are offering a limited number of pro bono sessions, particularly for organisations that are looking for specific support. I've just seen a message saying that we've got no sound at the moment, so hopefully that will come back shortly. Do keep commenting if you don't have sound, we'll try and address those technical difficulties. So yeah, we do have some pro bono one-to-one sessions that are available, so if you would like to sign up for one of those, do drop us a line at our info@achatesphilanthropy.com email address. We have got a limited number of those, so if we are oversubscribed, we will have to make some decisions about who we allocate those to and how, so do bear with us. We will try to give everyone sessions as they need them, but obviously we have got limited time. We're a very small team, we're a small organisation, but we would like to do our best to help as many of you as we possibly can. So I think on that note, I will hand over to our director, Caroline McCormick, if I may.
Thanks, Cerian. And just to add to Cerian's points, that this session is broadcast live on the 27th of March. It's going to remain up on YouTube for people to reference. But of course, we should note that everything we say is as accurate as we can make it today. But of course, as Cerian said, things are changing very rapidly, so may be out of date by the time you view the session. I'm Caroline, I'm the director of Achates Philanthropy, and I am really sad that we're having to have our Achates Live online for the first time, but I'm also very glad to be able to stand in solidarity with all of you in the sector who are doing, as you always do, remarkable work, making sure that our arts organisations continue to play the vital role that we all believe it plays in society. So thank you once again for the remarkable work you do. I also just want to give a very brief thank you to the Achates Philanthropy team, who have been working around the clock for the last 2 weeks to support as many arts organisations as they can in this time. And of course, I want to welcome and thank Safina for joining us today at short notice. Really appreciated, Safina, and I do know that lots of organisations are looking forward to hearing just your thoughts and ideas about where things are at the moment. It's great that you've opened up this time to so many organisations, so thank you. As Cerian has said, what we're going to do very briefly is to go through a quick overview of where we think things stand at the present time in the sector. Then we're going to look at the different types of funding sources and what we think the ramifications are, very broadly speaking, for the sector, particularly focusing on trusts and having a chat with Safina in detail at this point. Then we're going to share a few examples of good practice and move on to your questions. So let's start with that overview of what we're seeing in the sector at the present time. I think the first thing that's really important that I acknowledge is the welcome news last night regarding freelancers and those self-employed. I know that's a huge relief to large numbers of people who work in the sector. It's such a significant proportion of people. But of course, we know that the funds aren't going to be released until June, and that makes a different kind of challenge for many people as well. And of course, those packages still don't support everyone. So we're going to talk later about some of the funding sources that are coming up and are available to help artists and freelancers and just how vital they are. As Achates Limited talks to organisations across the country, I've had calls from Scotland, England and Wales this morning alone. We really are seeing a very mixed picture. I think that it isn't as simple as the size of an organisation, its art form, or indeed its regional locality in terms of the implications for the organisation. It really is contingent on the funding model and mix that that organisation has and how that is impacting it and how long it will impact it for. So we're talking to tiny organisations who are facing complete challenges to their operation and equally very large ones as well. Happily, we're also talking to organisations who find themselves in a positive position and are looking to reach out and support others. So it really is a completely different landscape to the one that we normally see. We found at Achates that we've sort of gone through 2 waves of decision making. Perhaps a week ago, there was the initial response to the situation. And then in the last few days, as the support for employed team members and now for freelance team members is filtering through, we're seeing a second wave of that decision making and planning coming through and really trying to work with the organisations to make sure that they are robust in the short term and in the long term in light of those challenges. One of the things that's becoming really clear is that organisations are being forced to use their reserves, which are generally kept for wind-up purposes now. And of course, that does mean that even organisations that are able to emerge from this crisis are going to do so with their resources severely depleted. And that is a real challenge beyond the period of COVID-19 itself, particularly as we are aware that there is a possibility of a resurgence of the contagion later this year. So that's something to think about in our planning. We're also very conscious of the fact that whilst there is a great deal of uncertainty about when venues and organisations will be able to really operate in the way that they normally do, that there is also an uncertainty about what will happen when they are able to reopen. We're seeing this week in China, cinemas reopening, and of course, hoping to attract visitors as normal, and that's certainly not being the case. So quite how quickly we'll be able to return to some kind of normality is really as yet very unclear. We are seeing some positive developments, as is inevitable also at a time like this. I think we're all amazed by how quickly we're coming to terms with technology and how we're thinking about technology and audiences in a way that perhaps we haven't done before. And later on, we're going to talk about some good examples of practice in the sector. But I think the point that we want to make at Achates is really that we believe that by taking an audience-informed approach that's distinctive to our methodology, by really thinking not only about ourselves and our organisations, but what our audiences want and need at this time, arts organisations have the ability to distinguish themselves by truly showing the value of art in all our lives. Moving on to a funding overview, so really thinking sector by sector in terms of the different types of funding sources. All of you, I'm sure, are well aware of the announcement from Arts Council in the last few days, and we're now waiting for the detail of that to be published at the beginning of next week. So in terms of additional funding, but also in terms of freeing up of reporting restrictions on existing NPO agreements and also on National Lottery project grants. Obviously, we all need to think very carefully about how those funds are used, both for our organisational sustainability, but also in terms of how we genuinely can work with audiences in this interim period. I've been very heartened to have conversations with organisations who are weathering this storm well, to hear that they would rather reach out and lend their support to others than simply apply for funds just because they can. And I think that kind of coming together to reunite our ecosystem at this key time is really inspirational. We know that it does mean that Arts Council is going to deplete its reserves, and that's going to be really challenging for us all in the coming year. It does mean there's going to be less strategic funds, we assume, and possibly impacting things like capital major funds that we've been looking to. So we're all going to have to think really carefully about the things that are really important to our purpose and practice in the next stage. In terms of corporates, I think what we're all hoping for is perhaps a situation analogous to the one in 2008, where few partnerships were directly cancelled that were already in train, but perhaps it will mean that new partnerships are on hold going forward. I think that we're all working as hard as we can to try and hold on to those partnerships and show value. And it seems to me that an increased emphasis on the social impact and benefits of our work is going to be really important at a time when the entertaining and glamour of our activities perhaps recedes into the background. In terms of individual giving, we are talking to organisations about being creative in their approach to retaining and engaging new donors, and to really demonstrate the value of their work at this time. And I'm going to come to some good practice examples in a few minutes. But now I'd like to turn our attention, if I may, to the trust sector, our focus for today, and to Sulina, who's director of the John Ellerman Foundation, who's going to talk us through how a leading funding organisation is approaching the crisis. Welcome, Sulina.
Thank you so much. Really pleased to be here, and just wish the circumstances were a little bit different.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for joining us. Firstly, how are you and how are your team? You must all be adjusting to home working and supporting the sector in a new way.
Well, thank you. That's so kind of you to ask. Honestly, we're all absolutely fine. I would just confess that I'm week 12 into my role at the John Ellerman Foundation. So I'd say that transforming a very office-based organisation into a completely home-based one is not something I was planning to do in my first 100 days, if I can be that honest. So we're fine. We're a team of 6. We're all home working. We have continued as far as we can in these unusual circumstances to deliver business as usual. And we had a grant making committee yesterday, and we've made some decisions, so that's really positive. But yeah, we're all absolutely fine, and I really appreciate you asking that. Thank you.
No, not at all. I think it's where we all have to begin, first of all, at the moment. Sulina, could you tell us a bit about the measures that you're putting in place at this time to support the sector?
So I think first and foremost, when it's all started to evolve and unravel, what feels like a lifetime ago, but was only 2 weeks ago, our first priority was to make sure that we could deliver our business at home, and that we could ensure that, you know, even the simple things, we visits that are face-to-face at second stage, and we suddenly thought, well, how are we going to do that? How are we still going to make grants, let alone can we do board meetings digitally, and all things that, you know, in fairness, we probably should have thought about before, but hadn't, quite simply. So I think it's been an element of just trying to shift from the kind of people-based version of how we delivered our work to a digital-based version of that. We were really keen that we signed up as soon as we could to what started with the London Funders Stand with the Sector pledge, which has now got its own standalone website, and over 200 funders have signed up to that. And we signed up to that on the first day that it was published a couple of Fridays ago now, because we wanted to be 100% clear that for us, we want to show flexibility and adaptability. We know that some of the things that our organisations have applied to us for cannot happen in these circumstances, whilst, okay, we weren't at a lockdown at that point, but we knew we were moving into the unknown. And so we're already a core funder, so we deliver core funding towards core costs, and we wanted to be super clear that we could be even more flexible and make that core almost unrestricted. We've been shifting payments around to support organisations if they need the payment bringing forward, and we've also been delaying things like progress reports, because at the moment we asked for a progress report in order to release the payment, but we understand that it's now time to be flexible and adaptable. So, to kind of a long-winded way of saying that ultimately we wanted to make sure that we could operate as normal in these circumstances, but offer real flexibility and an ability to be adaptable, and to ensure that whilst we have to focus on the day-to-day, especially now when it feels so extraordinary, the day-to-day, I've been really keen to ensure that we're feeding into conversations that are happening across other trusts and foundations who fund in the arts and culture sector, and telling them what we're hearing, so that we all are kind of having a collective sense of what's going on.
Fantastic. And I have to say, I was so impressed to see just how quickly that London Funders Network response came out. I thought it was hugely impressive. And as you say, a growing list day by day. And I think that's a great reassurance to many people in the sector, absolutely. One of the things that we're hearing from our clients and from the community is really about how to communicate with you at this time, because I think people very much want to be sensitive and thoughtful about what they're doing, and respectful of the pressures that you're under. How often should people in touch? How much information should they be sharing? And how honest should they be with you at this time?
To be honest with you, as a funder, we're in a completely privileged position in that in many ways, we have the wonderful job any day of the year of giving money away to fantastic causes. So my response to that would be, you know, what's that analogy of, you know, put the life mask on yourself first. Don't worry about whether you think we're busy as a team of 6, because I can assure you our issues are not anything like any issues you may be facing. So that's a really, again, super kind of you to say, but my thinking and what I'm hearing from colleagues in other trusts and foundations, recognizing that some of them are, you know, we're a team of 6, some of the arts funders are a team of 2 or a team of 6 too, and everyone is dealing with this on a personal level as well as a professional level. So notwithstanding all of those types of caveats, I would say that as your funder, we shouldn't be, you know, our feelings, or however is the best way of putting it, should not be the priority. My advice and my feeling would be that please talk to us. If you need something changing, if you need a payment bringing forward, if you need something delaying, if you need just a chat about the fact that what you may have originally wanted funding from us for needs to be converted to something else to try and preserve your reserves or whatever it might look like, then that is what you should be doing if that is helpful. Obviously, I don't think this is a time to start thinking, right, I've got to do, you know, daily reports to my funders, because frankly, you'll be doing that to your staff, to your board, to other kind of key stakeholders. So I wouldn't add us to that list. I would just say talk to your funders, and you know, some will be experiencing their own difficulties. I found out that we don't have call forwarding on our phones, so it means that you have to email us in the first instance, although I emailed everyone and they have my mobile number too. So we are contactable in that regard. But, it's, notwithstanding that it's not going to be as easy as it might have been normally, where you just pick up the phone. So it's not going to be in a perfect way of getting in touch with us, but I would just say do what actually works for you, what helps. Please be honest. If you really feel like something is going to be going wrong because of this situation, then talk to us. If we happen to know that there are a group of funders that you're involved in and that you get support from, then we're in contact as well. So if that helps, we're trying to figure out who we are all collectively funding in common as well, so that we can try and think more strategically and collaboratively about how we can support you.
Thank you, Safina. And I have to say, the humanity of that response is rather wonderful. And I think just how we're all feeling right now is just in terms of actually being honest and sharing with each other. And what I particularly love is the invitation to think of you as partners and to treat you in that way. Absolutely. I think that's it. We're all trying to pull to a common goal and to make the best work possible happen in these difficult times. So I know that will be hugely welcomed. Can I ask you about new bids at this time? When people are thinking about applying to you, and I know that some organisations will be thinking about using this time to focus on trusts and foundation bid writing, should people be reaching out to you first, or should they just be applying? Should organisations be thinking about particular factors in terms of demonstrating they're a good investment at this time?
So I think at the end of the day, you guys are the experts. So I would just ask that you put forward the bids that you think are most necessary and reflective of what your organisations need. And then obviously we will apply our own judgments about how we feel we can best respond to what we're hearing. We want to continue grant making as usual, but we are already planning for some potential need to caveat our processes. So if that's a case of, at the moment it takes us 5 months to make a grant, do we need to think about if we can make that any quicker? And I'm not making any promises. I'm just saying that I want to be super clear that we want to do grant making as normal, but we understand that we might need to make some tweaks in order to support us during this time. We absolutely recognise that, given that we often make multi-year grants, it's hard to know what tomorrow looks like, let alone several years hence. So for us as a core funder, it's slightly easier, because if you kind of want something towards core costs, do with, in our case, development of new work, and work that kind of is shared as widely as possible, and kind of really trying to promote artistic excellence, then yeah, it might be core cost towards that. But we do recognise that there is a need right now to kind of sustain the foundations that a lot of organisations have built. So it may not be as easy to say it's going to be a load of new stuff. It might just be sustaining and consolidating the stuff that already exists.
Yeah.
And I think with the Stand With the Sector pledge that's been signed, obviously cannot speak for any funders other than myself and the Ellerman Foundation, but I'd say that that pledge says that there is a openness to flexibility, to moving from project funding to core or unrestricted funding. So if you are going to pick up the phone, then I would try and lead with that, if you think that will be helpful for your organisation, because it is hard to plan for projects. And then the last thing I would say is, with us as a funder, we've always said, if you have inquiries, if you want to get a bit of guidance before making an application, then do. I would just caveat it with, at the moment, it would have to be through email, and then we'll try and arrange a call.
That's really helpful, Safina, I think. Thank you. And people just want to do this right as best they can at this time. And I think just that guidance is so helpful. Could I ask, Obviously, everybody is thinking about how they serve their audiences and how they present themselves at that time. It's really interesting to think about how people do go about that and whether or not you think that's going to distinguish them in the eyes of funders going forward, whether they're able to play a useful role in really thinking about their audiences.
It's hard to say, really, isn't it? Because ultimately we don't, I was really struck by your point earlier around, just because something has reopened hasn't meant that numbers have returned to normal, like the cinemas in China. So I think there's an element of course, we want to see organizations reflecting on what this pandemic might mean for them in the short and medium term. But I just honestly think, how can, I'm struggling to figure out as a foundation what this means for us in the short, medium and longer term. I'm thinking about it and I'm happy to share those things with people, but I don't think any of us have the answers. So if there is a case of organizations putting forward what is essentially almost looks like business as usual with some kind of reflection on what COVID could or couldn't mean for you, then that seems, completely legitimate. Of course, I would say if there are people in the sector who absolutely feel like they know what the innovations that are required during this pandemic and after this pandemic, and feel comfortable and confident about sharing it. And you were saying about, people coming together and the sector kind of knitting together at the moment because it's happening, then I would say collaborate on those things as hard as you can, because I know I've been in conversations where we've talked about how we, for previous roles, how we can digitize our collections. Yeah. And, that is a huge undertaking without the stress and pressure of a pandemic. That was while, our biggest stresses was feeling like we had too much to do and, not enough money. But yeah, so I just think if any of us feel like we have innovations that we can share, then do. But I understand that we might still be thinking in that kind of business as usual mindset with some caveats.
It's really hard to move outside the eternal present, I think, at the moment, isn't it? I certainly find myself sort of Groundhog Day going through the same things over and over. Yeah. A few weeks ago, I was lucky enough to be in Belfast working with Northern Ireland Opera and really learning quite a bit about the situation there over recent years, as the government has essentially been out of office and unable to make decisions about applications to funders because they weren't getting their grants from Arts Council announced until the beginning of the financial year. And we'd really seen a decline in activity in Northern Ireland as a result. And that echoed to me in this situation, in the sense that I could see that people were, because they couldn't be sure when projects were going to start, not making funding bids, and there being a huge decline in activity as a result. What should people do if they're not sure when their project's going to start? Should they still be making an application, but with a note that these timetables might change?
So I would look at the specific advice from the funders that you are seeking to make applications to. Or pick up the phone and ask them, email first and then there'll be a phone call at some point. Although I'm sure there are some who are more kind of have better telephony than I do. Anyway, not, regardless of that point. But yeah, no, I would just say, look at what the guidance is, what are they telling you? And if it is a project that's in mind, and you might even see some funders moving into different spaces and being less specific about programs of work. I don't know. But yeah, I would just say, look at the specific guidance that's coming out from the funders who you're looking to apply to. And it does seem like, they are being very kind of, the group side, the funders I'm speaking to are trying to keep their information as up to date as possible.
Absolutely. And then a final question from me before I go into good practice and then questions from our audience. I'd want to think about next financial year and onwards. Obviously, after 2008, we saw an impact on trust assets as a result of the economic crisis then, and we know that this situation is likely to be worse. Should people be assuming that funding is going to be much more competitive next year?
It's almost impossible to say. I think I think it's really difficult to say. So we've lost money on our endowment, like a lot of the people I've been speaking to have as well. We invest in the long term, oftentimes, trusts and foundations. So in the same way that things got rebuilt post 2008, they can be rebuilt post this, I guess, but I'm not an expert. So my thinking is this: I think that the conversations a lot of us are already having as trusts and foundations is how can we sustain our spend, and not do the kind of 3-year smoothing that tends to happen, or whatever else it might get referred to as by others. So my feeling is that those conversations have already started with trusts and foundations and their boards. I can't speak for all of them, but I can say that that is a conversation I'm having with colleagues across the trust and foundation sector about whether or not this is a time we can sustain our spend. I've also seen things like the Future Foundations UK plea and statement that came out last week around whether or not this is the time to really think about spending down or spending more, by dipping further into the endowments that funders have. And obviously some are already looking into doing this. And that's incredible. And obviously we've seen that Arts Council are using reserves too. I know they're a little bit different to a trust and foundation, but I think that conversation is also already being had as well. So it's week 2 in official terms, but I just want to reassure that from the people I'm speaking to in the sector, not to say that I'm speaking to all of them, of course, but it is really clear that we are looking at how, if it is at all possible, because for some of us it won't be, because for some the endowments are a lot smaller, and they can't weather the kind of hits that they're taking. But those of us that can are looking at whether or not we can sustain our spend. And we are also very mindful of the fact that questions are being asked about whether or not we should be spending down on endowments.
Safina, that's so helpful. That really is interesting to learn, and I know will be music to the ears of a lot of people to know that the foundations are thinking about this in such a careful way. Thank you. I'm going to very quickly now just give you a few examples of good practice, and then we're going to take questions for Safina and for myself if helpful. So as you know from our mailing, at Achates Philanthropy, we're recommending that you will want to take your work as a cultural organisation to online, and to really present a virtual offering of some kind. We're suggesting that that shouldn't be just business as usual online, but really considering your new environment and reflecting on the needs of your communities through our audience-informed approach. And I think that what we're seeing is that really simple things are really, really effective, and that at this moment people are more interested in authenticity than they are necessarily at high production standards. Alongside that, it's very much our recommendation in terms of fundraising that you think of what we are calling a curated campaign. Now, what we don't necessarily mean by that is a fundraising campaign. You may not actually be asking people for money at all, but what you are doing is relationship building at this time. I think all of us are deeply aware at this moment of what it's like to be isolated to whatever degree, and we know there are many others who are experiencing that far more greatly than we are. I think that we all work in the sector because we believe of the value of culture in our lives, and that this moment we can really demonstrate the value that we're bringing to everyone. So we're recommending thoughtful campaigns to prospects and donors that really are curated moments of joy that arrive at a time of need and give them something of interest, entertainment, distraction and transformation, taking them to a new place. And we're encouraging organisations to really think about how they want to come out of this period in the eyes of their donors and supporters, what messages they want to communicate, and really to build that, as I say, as a communications campaign across this period. Thinking about how you ask for money is really important. We know that we've all had emails thinking about people to perhaps donate ticket money rather than perhaps having a refund, and how that's done, the tone of voice, the style, the personal approach is so important in all of this. So quickly, do's and don'ts. Do's: warm, positive and personal. Kane, who's our development director, who led the campaign for Battersea Arts Centre and then post Sophia, the Phoenix campaign, said to me that those 3 words are what really resonated with their audiences. And as I say, those small moments of joy that arrive in people's inboxes at this moment, whilst being sensitive to the difficulties that people might be going through, I think are really key. Corporate letters, corporate tones of voice, redirection to an archive or a website very generically. Frankly, I'm binning those, and I'm sure you are too. If I didn't have time before, I most certainly don't have time now. And I want to be engaged in a real community virtually if I can't be in person. So, some quick good practice examples that I've seen. I want to try and celebrate a few organisations from across the country, and of course it's a tiny sample of the many examples that we see, and many that I'm sure I'm not aware of as well. First up, National Centre for Writing in Norwich. They have curated a tremendous offer of reading and writing opportunities that anyone can be engaged with of any age, and by local writers, leading personalities, etc. The Arab British Centre here in London, they do a tremendous amount of training and workshops, and they've very quickly got that work up online and are really making a great offer to their community. So well done to them. Mosaic Rooms, one of my favourite organisations from a visual art perspective here in London, they have done a great job of making sure that their content is beautifully curated, as it always is, and really thoughtful in its communication. Beat Freaks in Birmingham have taken their usual thoughtful and consultative approach to consulting with young people. Really great to see an organisation reaching out and respecting that generation. The Old Vic, I want to raise a little hat off to the Old Vic for their wonderful personal letter from Matthew Orchus, which I know has touched a lot of people. Hay Festival and their campaign. Hay Festival is one of those great British festivals that's facing a real challenge at this time, having to cancel the festival this year. And I know that many of you have supported their online campaign already, and they're doing brilliantly well in a really difficult situation. And I know tonight we have live broadcasts from Northern Ballet, from Sadler's Wells, from Royal Opera House, and many others that I can't list here. So bravo to you all, and keep up the good work. Questions? Cerian, do you want to field a few for us?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Caroline, and thank you so much to Sulina. So far, this has been really interesting, and I hope it's useful to our audiences watching at home at the moment. So we've got a couple of questions. They're quite conceptually large questions, so it may be that we can't fully answer them today, but I think it would be really interesting to hear your initial responses to these 2 questions. The first is from Scully, who asks, do we think there's going to be any move to ask organisations with endowments to release them, particularly with reference to those with catalyst endowments? I think that's a really interesting question. Which also ties in to Scully's second question about whether we feel what the view is going to be, particularly from a trust and foundations perspective, around organisations that don't necessarily have reserves or endowments.
Perhaps I could take the first part of that question and then ask Sulina to add in. So, as some of you know, I've worked with BOP Consulting for 6 years now on the Catalyst programme, and indeed worked with the Old Vic very closely on the establishment of their endowment. I would say that one of the challenges with endowments is very often their restrictions don't necessarily allow you to release them in quite that way. So it really will depend on the nature of the conditions and the terms of that endowment. Having said that, I think that each organisation, according to their needs, is going to be looking at that very, very carefully. I think if an organisation is in a real emergency situation, they may be putting forward a motion to release some of those funds if it's about their absolute continuity as an organisation. But ultimately, endowments are there to help organisations weather the storm in the medium term. So I would have thought that whilst people may be looking at how they can increase opportunities at this time, they won't want to really draw those endowments down unless they absolutely have to. Sulina, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Just on the trust and foundation perspective, on the second part of the question, I do think that ultimately it will come down to how trusts and foundations work with their decision makers, so oftentimes their board, to think about what their kind of appetite to risk and to I'd say mainly to risk is, and to recognize that this is the time to stay flexible and adaptable, so that, you know, we aren't necessarily rejecting on the basis of having reserves or not having them, or having an endowment or not having them. It's about what kind of organizations do we want to partner with and support and fund to do great work, and that has to kind of stay front of mind. But obviously I do think that those considerations will have to factor into some of the decisions if demand increases, and then I just hope that as trusts and foundations we can be completely transparent about what it is we are doing and why we're making the decisions we're making, based on, you know, whether we want reserves, don't want reserves, etc.
Absolutely, and presumably if you are an organisation with very limited reserves, it's worth explaining the context to that and why that situation is. I mean, I've spoken to organisations who, a good example is the King's Head Theatre, who've done brilliant work in the last 2 years to build up a reserve, but that is a reserve of 3 months, which they really don't want to have disappear. And I really would support an organisation like that in trying to preserve some kind of stability beyond this period. I think it's a really interesting tension, and presumably people should just articulate their recommendations and what they're doing and why.
And we know that trusts and foundations are still supporting organisations with high or low reserves, and they have their different kind of reasons for doing so. I think there just may be a demand now to have complete clarity on why trusts and foundations may be making the decisions that they're making, because, you know, I think we need to feel that we can ask those questions and get that clarity.
Absolutely. Cerian, do we have some more questions?
Oh,
there we are.
Thank you. So I was muted. We do have some more questions coming in now. So we have, are we going to see a new focus on funding of digital programmes announced by trusts and foundations, do we feel? Obviously, Safina, it's much too early for you to respond directly in terms of your longer term funding plans for the John Ellerman Foundation. But Caroline, would you mind responding on this first, please?
Sure. I think it's really interesting to see, once again, how creative our sector is and how brilliant they are at coming up with responses. For me, digital is just a medium of communication and engagement. And if that's the right response going forward, that's a medium people should use. I just hope it will get more integrated into our thinking, because it will enable us to reach more people in due course. So I hope it will be less about digital being segmented on its own and more about digital becoming a whole part of what we do anyway, to ensure that we're reaching a diverse range of audiences.
Thank you, Caroline. I think that's a really interesting response. Like I said, Safina, obviously you can't speak directly to John Ellerman's funding priorities going forward, but what's your feeling around the wrapping of digital more widely into programmes?
I think it's a really, really good way of looking at it, and actually probably the most kind of strategic and thoughtful way of looking at it, to think about wrapping it up as part of the wider offer. Obviously, we are seeing that there are a lot of kind of large pooled funds that are emerging as a result of the crisis, and things like the National Emergencies Trust. There is a London Funders Fund for London, and so on and so forth. And I do think that, you know, there are already digital funding collaborations that exist in the trust and foundation space. So there's one that the Centre for Accelerating Social Technology kind of do a lot of the hosting for. I'd say it would be, you know, you wouldn't need a crystal ball to assume that it's probably worth keeping an eye on what that fund, I think it's called We Are Catalyst, or the Catalyst Fund rather, is doing, because, you know, the demand across all elements of the civil society sector for digital infrastructure, not just in arts and culture, is going to be very high as a result of the, you know, what we're experiencing right now. So I think, can't say if there'll be a funds released, but I think it's worth watching those that are already in this space.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Safina. We've got time for a couple more questions, I think. So here's one. So how can we keep trustees engaged at this difficult time, particularly while they're busy with their own operations? I think that's a really interesting question. I think from a business perspective, we're all really aware of the adjustments that we've had to make within our own organisations, and certainly we are, as an organisation at Achates, are aware of the adjustments that our clients and partners have had to make to their businesses. So how can you keep your trustees engaged, particularly at this incredibly difficult time where everyone is getting used to new ways of working and new ways of living?
I think it's a great question, and I absolutely understand the challenge. I'm a trustee of a arts organisation myself, as well as our own Achates Foundation. And it was a few days into the crisis before I thought, my goodness, I haven't messaged them to say, what can I do? Because of course, we're all so distracted and engaged in the details of our own situations and lives. So what I would suggest is, as always, is to break it down into manageable tasks. Think about things that your trustees actually can do and contribute to, because the last thing anybody needs now is a load of suggestions about which opera to put on, thank you very much, any more than you need that in your day-to-day operations. Give them directed tasks and give them structure to operate within is what I would recommend. I'm really conscious that you have got those trustees there because of their skills and the assets that they bring, so focus them on them at this present time. And any supporting material you can give them in aiding them in doing so is always really critical. We talk a lot when we talk about engaging our trustees in fundraising about how often they're not doing so, not because they're necessarily reluctant per se, but because you may have misunderstood the degree to which they have the confidence to do so. It's going to be difficult to judge that long distance. So I think it's really important to warmly ask them, have they got everything they need? Would they like a draft letter, whatever it is, and make sure that they're fully supported and giving them those quite directed tasks, whilst engaging them when and where relevant in bigger conversations, absolutely.
I would just very quickly add to that, because I'm having to do this with my own trustees. I think absolutely back yourself. You know your organisation and you know your trustees. So where you think that there is a specific trustee that can support you on a specific problem, go directly to them and make it clear why you're asking them, what you need from them, how they got to do it, and get on with that, really. And then I would just say, in the same way that, you know, the answer around how often you should be keeping in touch with your trusts and foundations, do what feels necessary and what feels useful. So I've limited it to, I email my trustees once a week with updates, and if I have nothing to update on, then I'm not emailing them, and I'll drop a line to the chair to say there's just nothing to update you on. So far that hasn't happened, to be honest with you, but I expect it might do. So I just think it's really important, back yourself, you know your organisation, you know what you need, and you know your trustees.
Nice.
Thank you, Sulina. I think those are really, really wise words, absolutely. So again, we have another quite big question here, which we may or may not be able to answer, because I think it speaks really to the very unpredictable situation that we're all living through at the moment. So in terms of mitigating risk and forward planning, how long are people looking at initial closure periods? What's our feeling on whether people are forecasting planning for 3 months down, what that might look like? Caroline, what are we seeing in terms of the bigger picture out there across the sector?
I think it's a good question, but it's obviously very difficult to answer with any degree of certainty. I think that organisations have been cautious in what they're saying publicly and, of course, privately planning for different scenarios. So I've talked to very big venues who are saying that, you know, they're rebooking things for September with the hope that that will go ahead. I've talked to theatres who are saying publicly that they're closed to sort of April, May, but really are planning for July. I think the picture's mixed and varied, and it partly depends on things like the capacity of your organisation. You know, is it going to be easier if you're a 100-seater theatre than if you're a 1,000-seater theatre? So I think the picture's really varied, and I don't think there's a simple answer to that. What I'm assuming most people are doing, and what I'm hearing is that people are putting plans in place with milestones for review against them, that they can then try and optimise the situation but mitigate risk.
Yeah, I think that's a really sensible answer as ever, Caroline. Yeah.
I don't know what Safina's hearing from people.
I would add that there's also in addition to everything you said, Caroline, which I completely support, is that there's a geographical element as well.
Yeah, so true.
So, you know, we're seeing a little bit of, you know, London is probably going to be slower to emerge. I mean, it's hard to say. The advice, the information is varying. So I think we're seeing just a slight geographical slant to it as well.
Really good point. Yeah, absolutely. Cerian, do we have time for one last question?
I think we do have time for one last question. I was about to say just that. So do we have any advice on how organisations can continue to engage new donors when success is to do with the live and community experience of events? I think that's a really great question that absolutely ties into what we were discussing earlier around how you maintain digital engagement, how you can keep audiences and donors with you when we can't do live events, when actually the engagement necessarily has to be more remote than we're used to dealing with.
Absolutely, and I think it really does come back to those points I was making about the curated offer and the curated campaign. I do think that live is the lifeblood for many of us, not exclusively, but for a lot of us, live performance is absolutely part of who we are and what we do. I think incorporating the digital is a learning experience, but we're very creative. Obviously, what you don't want to do is just pop something up online without any audience base. It's going to be really difficult to attract people in the noise that's coming out at the present time. So how you go about things in terms of that curated offer and the accompanying curated campaign to prospects and donors is partly going to be really thinking about very carefully as ever who your audience is now and who your audience that you would like to reach is, and trying to link up to them. Now, I know that for many organisations, data is a real problem and challenge. And I think that is going to be something that is going to be a problem in this period ahead, because those organisations that really have no data and don't necessarily have a strong brand presence outside of their immediate community, it's going to be really hard to get that noise heard. In which case you may be thinking about opportunities locally within communities that you can get that profile out and really making sure that people know you're there. And I think that thinking about different ways of communicating, because people are operating in a range of social economic situations at the present time, you know, the community groups that have mobilized to help local people, is that a way of raising awareness? It may not be in your normal communication strategy, but those kind of tactics might be really valuable in thinking about telling people you're there at a time when it's very difficult to attract people through the usual ways.
And I would just very briefly add, and you know, can't follow that answer, that was fantastic, but just very briefly add that there is something about recognizing that yes, the end is your live and your community events that you do, but actually think about the steps before that. What are the qualities? What are the ways in which you work? The values that you have as an organization? That's what you should be discussing with your donors so that they can then support you at the ground level of the next journey that you're going on now to get to an end product, which might be more digital. So I think it's just about remembering, yes, you know, donors are interested in that kind of output, the end product side of things, but this is about reminding them of all the steps that go into that end product that you still have as an organization, but it's now got to be potentially diverted to other methodologies.
I really love that point. And I think the point about sharpening your purpose right now, really thinking, who are we? What are we doing? What are we trying to achieve is so key, and using the new mediums to try and achieve it.
Absolutely. I think really great points from both of you there. I think just from my perspective, I feel at the moment that in terms of fundraising practice, in terms of communications, the messages aren't different than what you've been saying already. I think it's about really tracking back, thinking about your mission, thinking about your vision, and just how do you really clearly communicate those to your audiences, to your prospects and to your donors at this key point in time when everyone is looking for engagement and everyone is looking for some kind of lift and reassurance in their lives. And art and culture, as we know, are the things that can often bring those to people in a way that other things can't. So we are sadly out of time for questions now. So all that remains, I think, is to say thank you so much to Caroline for your wise words as ever. And thank you, Safina, for taking the time and joining us this afternoon. It's really appreciated. We hope for all of you at home that this has been a useful conversation. We will be continuing to do our live sessions online. The next session is the 27th of April at 2 p.m. That will be hosted by our Director of Development, Kane Moore, and will be focused on fundraising through digital content and what best practice looks like in that format.
Cerian, I'm sorry, I think it's actually the 7th of April, 2 weeks from now, isn't it?
I'm sorry, was that not what I said?
No, sorry, you said 27th, it's the 7th. Yeah.
Excuse me, I had the 7th written down and I obviously just said the wrong date. So, as I said earlier, if you've got any more detailed questions that you'd like to ask, or you'd like some more bespoke advice from us about your particular situation in your organisation, then do drop us a line at info@achatesphilanthropy.com, and we will see if we can schedule you a pro bono one-to-one session. Other than that, we would love to receive your feedback on today's session. So again, do drop us a line at our info@ address. And hopefully we will see you all back here on the 7th of April for another conversation about fundraising in the time of coronavirus. Thank you so much for joining us all, everybody, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you, and take care, everyone. Thank you, Safina. Thank you, Cerian. Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Stay well. Bye.